Today's story is about Raja Vikramaditya and his battle with an evil sorcerer, against whom he needs powerful trans Himalayan allies. Luckily, the Princess of China is ready to help. Welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. I know I said last week that we'd be doing the Mahabharata, but I have had a new request since then. It's Samay's birthday, and he requested to hear his favorite story. So, happy birthday, Samay! And here we are, talking about Vikramaditya and the Princess of China. We will be doing the Mahabharata next time. So if you were eagerly waiting for the Lakshagruha episode, I'm sorry, but you'll just have to be patient for another week. Let's jump right into today's story. It begins with Raja Vikramaditya in his court. Some may say that Vikramaditya needs no introduction, but I'll provide one nonetheless. Vikramaditya, or Vik as I shall call him, was a king in ancient India. He ruled the kingdom of Ujjain, and there are many stories about him. There are two primary series, the Vikram-Betaal stories and the Singhasan Battisi, both of which we have covered on this show before. And that's not all. Vik also features in a number of other stories, to the extent that some historians believe Vikramaditya was a title conferred on many different kings at different times. For the purposes of today's story, let's assume they were in fact the same king. Having prominently featured in all those stories, Vik was very popular. Naturally, there were action figures, comic books, and he also endorsed footwear, weapons, and sports chariots. From all of those, he earned a decent pile of money. Everything should have been okay, but it was not. And the first sign of trouble was raised to him by his faithful minister. Vik observed that this minister, let's call him Mantri, seemed to be wearing multiple hats today. Well, he was wearing just one turban, but what Vik meant was that Mantri seemed to be doing multiple things here. He had read the weather report, the sports headlines, and he had also talked about revenue projections on all of Vik's merchandise sales. Come to think of it, Vik just realized that Mantri had also cooked him his breakfast and served it to him. Vik rudely interrupted Mantri as the minister was describing a new line of sneakers that might help counteract the recent dip in sales volume. But Mantri, hang on. Where is everyone? Your Highness, the rest of the staff all resigned or were fired, and everyone else stopped attending after you fired the chefs. Probably because there were no more free cookies and drinks. Most of them were pretty disgruntled. How do we gruntle them? Asked Vic. Can we get the chefs back? They weren't so bad after all. Not that I mind your cooking, but you've got too much on your hands. At last, Vic was learning to be tactful. He couldn't offend this one person who had stood by his side. I'm afraid it's impossible, Your Highness, Mantri replied. They've all joined the Jadoo Tona club just outside the city. Well, I'm glad that you haven't left me, Mantri, Vic said. At which point, Mantri bit down on his tongue. He thought it best not to mention that he had applied to join that very club 5 times already. He'd been rejected each time, but hadn't given up hope. Mantri was considering applying again. Vic went on to say that maybe he should go and see what the fuss was all about. Could Mantri fetch him his trusty go-to disguise? That of a street vendor, complete with a bhelpuri cart? Mantri did, but not the trusty go-to disguise. The bhelpuri street vendor was a very well-known disguise. Thanks to last summer's blockbuster, Vikram-Betaal and the four-headed dragonfish. There was this scene where the four-headed dragonfish invades the city. All seems lost as the dragonfish is about to crush a helpless bhelpuri seller. But then, that helpless bhelpuri seller whips off his disguise. It's Vic, and he pretty much wipes the city streets with the dragonfish. That's also why, nowadays, you don't see any four-headed dragonfish. Vic drove them to extinction. But the point is that that scene was burned into people's memory. The Ancient India Today magazine even called it the movie of the century. So Mantri cleverly substituted the bhelpuri cart with a panipuri cart. But the jury is out on whether Vic would actually have been recognized. You see, as Vic made it from the palace to the city gates and from there to the river, he encountered a grand total of 0 people. He did not have to wonder where they were, because he saw that soon enough. He was crossing the river to where the Jadoo Tona club was, and he found that that's where everyone was. What's more, his own chefs were there, handing out free cookies to all the club members. For a while, Vic considered approaching them and ordering them back. But before he could do so, the club meeting was called to order. Vic decided that he'd better stay out of sight for now, until he found out what the club intended to do. He did not have to wait long. A bearded old man stood up on a stage. He tapped on the mic to get everyone's attention. Let's call this man Mogambo. Vic stared at Mogambo for a full minute. This man had one of the most evil expressions the king had seen. It was the type that might scare a four-headed dragonfish. Mogambo began by saying that he was going to do a very magically fantastic magic trick. He invited a volunteer. Vic watched in horror as the person who volunteered was one of his former ministers. The guy Vic had treated like his own brother. Now, what was his name? Vic couldn't remember, so let's just call him Ex-Mantri. How could Ex-Mantri have deserted Vic? And that's not all. It sounded like Ex-Mantri's son was in on it as well. The boy was up on the stage with Ex-Mantri, and he seemed to obey his dad's every command. At Mogambo's signal, Ex-Mantri brought out a knife and plunged it into his own son. The crowd gasped, but Mogambo assured them, "It's all okay. Don't panic, folks. This is just a demonstration. Nobody, and I mean nobody, has magic powers like mine, folks. Believe me, they're tremendous. The best. I've got the most incredible spells, the most beautiful enchantments. They're huge. No sorcerer in the history of sorcery has ever seen anything like it. It's unbelievable, really. Truly unbelievable. People are always asking me, how do you do it? And I just say, I got the magic touch, believe me. My magical prowess is unmatched. It's tremendous. Vikramaditya only wishes he had my powers. Believe me, he's weak, but not me. I'm strong, I'm powerful, and my magic is going to make India great again. Ex-Mantri whispered to Mogambo, wishing that he'd get a move on. And now, watch me. See how I bring Ex-Mantri's child back to life, Mogambo added. He waved his hand, but nothing happened. It's not working, someone screamed from the audience. And that annoyed Mogambo. Look, let me tell you something. You know whose fault it is? It's not my fault. There's someone here in the audience who doesn't like me. They messed it up, big league. I had everything perfect, under control. My spells were flawless. But then this person, they came in and they caused chaos. Total disaster, folks. I don't want to mention any names, but let's just say they're going to get their due. They don't have what it takes. I mean, who could possibly make such a mess? It's sad, really. It's a sad, sad situation when someone else's incompetence ruins my brilliant work. But don't worry, I'm going to fix it. I always fix things. I always come out on top. Because unlike them, I'm a true sorcerer, a winner, and they're the losers. It's their fault and they're going to pay for it, believe me. Unlike other modern-day narcissistic politicians, though, Mogambo did know his stuff. He said, I now turn you into a dog. And it worked. Vic had been rooted to the spot behind his rock, not daring to move for fear of being caught. And now he had turned into a dog. If he had stayed behind his rock, maybe he'd have had a chance later to sneak away. But now, with his super sharp canine abilities, he could smell his favorite food, Possum Prasad, a brand that he had endorsed in his past life, even though he had never tasted it. Why not? He wondered. Possum Prasad was simply the delectable delight for your possum pooch, to quote his own line from his own ad. He dashed to the stage where Mogambo had a doggy bowl full of possum prasad. Everyone in the Jadoo Tona club laughed at the sight of this pathetic dog that was now eagerly eating the food. "Don't worry, folks. He's completely harmless now," Mogambo added. "He can't bother your favorite leader, me. He really thinks he's a dog. Now let's get on with our plans for defeating Vikramaditya." Mogambo said all that without realizing that Vic was already in his power. Luckily for Vic, though, Mantri got busy when Vic did not return in time for the morning news the next day. Mantri managed to get an astrologer from the yellow pages of a neighboring country. No prizes for guessing where Vic's astrologers were. This astrologer, whom we shall call Jyotishi, said that he knew exactly what was going on. Saturn was trapped in the house of Mars because he had crossed Jupiter, which meant Vic had been changed into a dog and was across the river, guarding Mogambo's camp from strangers and begging for his human keepers to walk him twice a day and to feed him more possum prasad. Luckily, Mogambo still hadn't realized it. If he did, it would be game over, and no possibility of a sequel. And even if Mogambo didn't realize it ever, it might still be game over for Vic tonight. Unless he was rescued, the change would become permanent. Jyotishi added that was just an arbitrary rule he had made up right then. But it helped the story along, didn't it? Mantri agreed that it did. And now, in an effort to move the story along further, he volunteered his twin sons to help rescue Saturn from the house of Mogambo. Well, dash it. Jyotishi knew exactly what he meant. He said that he had a handy bottle of Polyjuice potion, just for such reasons. 5 minutes later, Mantri's sons were transformed into deer and were dashing towards Mogambo's camp. They ventured close enough so that Vic's canine sense of smell detected them before Mogambo's guards had any clue. Loudly barking, Vic bounded swiftly from the camp. He had only one goal in mind. He must protect his master at all costs. The master who had kindly been feeding him possum prasad. These two deer were clearly here with nefarious purposes to hurt Mogambo. Though his henchmen thought nothing of it, Mogambo was alert. This might be a trick. He must investigate, and quickly. And he must do it himself. This was no time to explain and delegate. Luckily, he too had some Polyjuice potion on him. Swiftly, he changed into an eagle and swooped into the air. And not a moment too soon, because he saw that his new pet dog was chasing two deer across the river towards Vic's palace. And what's more, on the other side, Mantri and Jyotishi were cheering on. Mogambo swooped down with his sharp talons, ready to grab the dog. Mogambo would kill it if he had to. But it must not cross the river under any circumstances. If it did, Mogambo would be powerless to do anything about it. Just as the clueless dog was about to be grabbed, one of the deer turned around and shielded it from the eagle. Vic was completely clueless. He thought he was supposed to be chasing the deer, and now the deer was shielding him from this missile that was about to fall on him. What was going on? Vic braced for an impact from either the eagle or the deer or both. But nothing happened. When he opened his eyes, he was safe and sound on his side of the river. And the eagle was cursing and shaking a fist at them. At which point, it lost altitude quickly and had to start flapping its wings again. It flew back to the camp and changed into Mogambo again. Vic turned to the deer to thank it. And then he saw that the eagle had managed to claw out one of the deer's eyes. First aid wasn't really available with all the doctors and nurses on the other side of the river. But the Jyotishi did change them all back into human form. Jyotishi explained that the eagle hadn't been able to cross the river. According to his calculations, Rahu was doing a somersault in Ketu's shadow, so Mogambo couldn't enter the realm of Jupiter. I thought Vic was Saturn, Mantri interrupted, before being glared at. Jyotishi went on to explain that this was just temporary. Soon, the moon would smash through the constellation of Kritika, or the Seven Sisters, like a bowling ball smashing through some very tiny bowling pins. And then Mogambo would similarly smash through Vic's castle, reducing it to rubble. And then even Vic's 4 Betals would not be able to help their king. There was a pause as all of them realized what Jyotishi had just said. Vic had 4 Betals, magical genie-like servants who obeyed him. Vic could very well have saved himself. If he had just once thought of them, they would have instantly appeared on the scene and taken him off to safety.
Hey, I had more important things to think about at that time,
Vic said defensively. But he did not elaborate that the more important thing that he had been thinking about was Possum Prasad. Jyotishi went on to say that there was nothing in his power to stop Mogambo. The only way out was for Vic to seek help from the Princess of China. She had more power than anyone else, and she could simply snap her fingers and make Mogambo disappear if she wanted to. The only way out was for Vic to go to the Princess of China. And if he impressed her, and even better, if he married her, Vic's problems would be solved. Mantri fetched Vic his horse, and they bid adieu. It was best for Vic to get started right away. Any moment, the moon may smash through the Pleiades or the Seven Sisters. Vic went, of course, but only after packing a big bag of Possum Prasad for the journey. Not for the horse, for himself. You could see that during his recent short stint as a dog, he had acquired a taste for dog food. Vikram headed in the general northern direction. The journey was long and difficult, especially the part where he had to cross the Himalayas. Those days, they didn't really have any decent GPS or even basic paper maps. Vic only knew where he was by asking people. he often asked the farmers he met on the way. For most of the journey, the answer that came back was that it was all owned by Vikramaditya. But one day, that answer changed because he was finally in China. A few more days of riding, and finally, Vic reached the vicinity of a large city. This was the capital city of the Emperor of China. But it was pretty late in the evening, so Vic decided to nap right where he was, in the woods, right outside the capital gates. As luck would have it, a gang of thieves came by. If thieving is all they had in mind, things would have been okay. But these were generous thieves. How can a thief be generous, you might ask? Well, hear me out. Thief gestured quickly to his buddies.
Hey, buddies, look over there. That's a real Indian horse. From India.
That's a pretty good omen. It means
we are going to get very rich very soon.
I bet we get a lot of Indian made gadgets and stuff. Unlike time travelers, such as myself, if you've only experienced the late 20th century onwards, I should add a bit of context here about India and China. One of those countries was flooded with a number of cheaply produced but highly useful consumer goods from their trans-Himalayan neighbors, and that country was not India. Anyway, the thieves did indeed have a good night that night. They looted a rich trader's home and came back with a big bag full of trinkets and gadgets, some toys, and most of all, some jewelry. As they were passing by the sleeping Vikram and his wide-awake horse, the chief thief decided that this horse was responsible for their good luck tonight. And so, it deserved a share of their loot. If the thieves had decided to give the horse some oats, or even just some water, things would have worked out okay. But they chose to gift the horse a gold necklace. If that's what they gave the horse, you can certainly imagine that what they kept for themselves was much more valuable. Well, the trader who was burgled certainly thought so. Early the next morning, he gave the police a very long list of all those things that were stolen. Gold and silver jewelry, a puppet home theater system, investment bonds, and lots of Vikramaditya action figures and comic books. The trader said that he didn't really care about the jewelry or the puppet home theater system and the investment bonds. He was most upset about the Vikramaditya merchandise. Rumor had it that those were not being produced anymore. Some kind of a labor shortage on the other side of the Himalayas. Or so he heard. The police got on it. A massive search was launched, and it wasn't long before the cops found the horse and the still sleeping Vikram. The necklace around the horse's neck was quickly and positively identified. Vikram was fast-tracked and produced before the emperor for a quick judgment. You might wonder that in a land that was crazy for Vikramaditya merchandise, why did no one recognize this action hero? Granted that he wasn't battling a four-headed dragonfish for them to get the context, but still, someone should have made the connection. There's an explanation. Vic had previously maintained a policy of only exporting defective merchandise and keeping the best for locals. That meant that the action figures in China looked nothing like Vikram in real life. And now, in front of the emperor, it was clear that everyone considered Vic guilty of the crime. They were ready to punish him for it. When asked for his identity, Vic could have admitted it, and then he would definitely have escaped punishment. But then he'd also be destroying all the ideals that he represented, at least in their minds. They had lionized him. He could not afford to be de-lionized. And what's more, China was a valuable market for his exports. So he kept quiet and accepted the punishment. It was horrible. The emperor ordered Vic's hands and feet to be chopped off. The king, who had ruled a huge country, was now just a poor soul cast into the city square, where people threw stones and insults at him.
Knives and swords may break my limbs, Vic thought, but words will never harm me, as long as they don't realize who I am.
There Vic was, in the city square, alone and neglected, unable to move. Not to mention that he was hungry and thirsty. More than that, they had taken away his remaining possum prasad. Oh, those villains! Night fell, and the streets were deserted. No doubt, everyone was in the puppet theatre, watching the newest movie. Vikramaditya versus the seven-headed crocodile snake. Except one man. And this was Telwala. He was an oil man. You know, a person who makes oil for a living. Telwala had been working hard in his factory, crushing seeds to squeeze out whatever oil he could. And now he was heading home to his family. He had missed all the action, and he didn't know why this handsome-looking man was lying here in the city square. Telwala took pity on Vic and carried him home. When his family returned from the puppet show, they were shocked that Telwala had dressed Vic's wounds and given him food and drink. Telwala's wife, let's call her Telwali, was sure that they were going to be in deep trouble because of this. The emperor had strictly ordered that Vic was to be left alone and helpless. Now it was too late to even cast him out. The Chinese city police, or the CCP for short, was ruthless in this regard. They would trace it back to Telwala and probably subject him to the same kind of punishment as Vic. So there was nothing to do but to shelter Vic and to pray that no one found out. That's what they did. Over time, Vic's blunt limbs didn't hurt as much. He even began to experience the joy of being a child again. And in this, Telwala indulged him. That meant piggyback rides and airplane-like flying motions with his spoon as he fed the man who was not much different in age than himself. Telwali was done here. She had adopted a completely Marge Simpson-like acceptance of her husband's eccentricities including when Telwala completely neglected his own children. Tonight was the limit. Telwali laid down an ultimatum. Vikram had to take a bath, or she would rat out to the CCP herself.
No way, Daddy, Vikram complained.
Telwala tried to patiently reason with him. Who wants ice cream after dinner? I do, Vic squealed in delight. Well, only those who have bathed are going to get ice cream, Telwala added.
Oh, all right, Daddy, Vic said.
But only if you take me to the princess's private swimming pool. Come on, at least he agreed to take a bath, Telwala said to his wife, who had thrown up her hands in defeat and was now leaving the room. The oilman carried Vikram on his back and sneaked in through a hole in the palace wall. Telwala left Vic in the pool and went back home, but promised to return in a couple of hours. Vic, meanwhile, took his time getting clean. After days and weeks of not bathing, he had acquired quite a smell. In the end, as he swam in the cool water, he sang a raga. Instantly, all the nearby lamps lit up. Vic may have lost his hands and his feet, but there were some special powers still remaining in his voice. A couple of hours passed, after which Telwala came and took Vic home. This repeated for several days before the princess finally caught on. Maybe she got her clue from all the lamps that were glowing brightly in the morning when she was sure that her maids had turned them off. Or maybe it was the noticeable deposit of dirt at the bottom of her swimming pool. However, the princess, whom I shall call Rajkumari, didn't need to stay up to figure out who was visiting her pool. She could simply check her crystal ball. In case you forgot, Rajkumari had magical powers. That's the whole point of Vic being here. Her crystal ball had a bit of a focusing problem, unfortunately. So all Rajkumari managed to learn was that the visitor was staying with an oilman. The next morning, Telwala received a summons to the palace. He went, fearing the worst. The CCP must have discovered that he was shielding Vic. But then he was relieved to see that every oilman was summoned, not just himself. The princess ordered each of them to bring her 100 jars of oil by tomorrow. Otherwise, they would all lose their heads. Every one of the oilmen knew that this day would be their last. There was no way that they could make even a single jar of oil in one day, even with a healthy supply of raw material. And just now, the supply chain from India seemed to be drying up. There must be some kind of major revolution going on there. Maybe a change of management in Ujjain. Anyway, to try to make 100 jars was impossible. Even if they all pooled their resources, they would reach 10 jars at the most. So they wouldn't even be able to save a single life. None of the oilmen even tried. Telwala said nothing that evening, but Telwali cursed Vic. He was responsible for this horrible situation. She was sure of it. And she wasn't wrong. But Vic kept his mouth shut. This probably wasn't the right time to ask for a piggyback ride or another bath in the princess's pool. That night, though, when everyone went to sleep, Vikram seemed to have matured suddenly. He thought of his four Betals. Instantly, they appeared before him. Looking at his situation, one of the Betals shook his head gravely and said that he didn't know how to fix Vic's hands and feet. Couldn't Vic see that as Betals, they themselves were reanimated corpses? If they hadn't figured out how to solve their own decaying body problems, they couldn't help him, could they? But Vic then clarified that he hadn't called them for that. He needed 100 jars of oil, and he needed them by dawn. Betals can zap from one place to another really quickly. That made it easy. Between the four Betals, they'd quickly assembled 100 jars of oil in an hour. From all kinds of places, but mostly from the Mumbai high field. There seemed to be a lot of oil there. It was not all the same type. Some of the jars had refined oil, some of them had crude oil, some others were full of vegetable oil, or olive oil, or coconut oil. But hey, oil was oil. When the oilmen all showed up, Telwala was the only one who had managed to produce all that oil. Rajkumari did not have the rest of them executed. The other oilmen could go back home now. And if they had already racked up massive debt, assuming yesterday had been their last day, they would still have to pay it back. Sorry. Well, there's probably a lesson in it somewhere about doing hard work and all that. Now, off you go. And she dismissed them. She then turned to Telwala and addressed him. He was trembling in fear. He wondered whether bringing the 100 jars had been the wrong thing to do. Relax, Rajkumari told him. It's nothing. I'm just inviting you to my Swayamvar tomorrow. A Swayamvar, in case you don't know, is a ceremony where the bride chooses her husband out of all the attendees. The choice is entirely the bride's, and it is legally binding too. Telwala relaxed. Oh boy, that's amazing. Yes, I'll be there. Can I bring my family? Rajkumari replied that he was allowed a +1, but not his wife. She asked Telwala to bring along the man who was staying with him. That was a direct order, and it could not be disobeyed. The next day, Telwala went to the palace with Vic on his back as usual. When Rajkumari selected the cripple out of all the people assembled there, everyone was shocked. During the news that night, some analysts speculated that the princess was making some kind of a political statement here. Others commented that the princess's wedding gift to her husband was just gross. She and her officials found Vic's severed hands and feet, and they were surgically attached back to Vic. Let's just hope that Rajkumari had some magic up her sleeve to reverse the decay and infection. The wedding was the very next day, and it was grand. When people found out that Vic was indeed Vikramaditya, the action hero from India, there was popular support for the idea. Of course, Vic first had to get his Betals to fetch him a lot of rich clothes and money and jewels. But what really swayed the crowd was that the Betals brought along a ton of merchandise that they distributed throughout the crowds for free. The ceremony was wonderful, and there was a celebration afterwards. Nothing dampened the festive atmosphere. Not even the news that Vikramaditya's kingdom was completely taken over by Mogambo. During the post-wedding celebration, there was an acrobatic group, and some jugglers, and finally, there was a magician. He claimed to be a magician, but Vic found that there was something familiar about him. It's only when the bearded magician grinned his evil grin that Vic recognized him. It was Mogambo. Probably. Or maybe his twin. After all, Mogambo didn't have a mole on his right cheek. And if this was a twin, maybe he wasn't so evil. But that was quickly resolved when Mogambo called a volunteer on stage. It was all staged, of course, because the person who stepped up was ex-Mantri, Vic's disgruntled former minister. Ex-Mantri had with him the corpse of his son, the very same one that Vic had seen executed at the beginning of the story. Mogambo waved his hand, and suddenly, ex-Mantri's son became alive again. "Ugh!" the boy exclaimed. "Hey, Dad, we were in India when you killed me, and now it suddenly looks like we are in the Emperor's palace in China?" After that, he added a growl and a roar. That last bit happened because even as he was speaking, Mogambo changed the boy into a ferocious tiger. The crowd was fascinated and applauded. This was first-rate magic. But they would not applaud for long. Mogambo now addressed Vic directly. "Vikramaditya, I'm here to spell your doom." Vic looked bored, almost.
Oh, get on with it then. But I'll tell you, I don't think much of this trick of yours. Granted, most people these days can't spell at all. But still, spelling your doom shouldn't be all that hard, even for you.
Mogambo did not like being insulted. He ordered his tiger to eat his enemy, and the tiger leapt towards Vic. But Rajkumari simply waved her hand. There was a flash, and the tiger changed its mind, and it attacked ex-Mantri instead. Mogambo was enraged. He was about to launch himself on Rajkumari, but he should have known what a terrible idea that was. He tried, and then he ended up in a worse situation than the ex-Mantri. Mogambo had his soul sucked out of him. He lost everything. His powers, but also his memory and all knowledge. He wandered the streets mindlessly. And one day, he wandered into the forest. And there, fittingly, he became a meal for ex-Mantri's son, who was still in tiger form. He had escaped shortly after eating up his evil father. Vic and Rajkumari had a happy life. But somehow, Rajkumari preferred her privacy. And because of that, there weren't too many action figures of her. That's it for this time. A couple of notes. Continuing the tradition of this show, the names of the characters are derived from the roles they play. Jyotishi is the Hindi word for astrologer, just as mantri means minister. Telwala means an oilman, and Telwali is oilwoman. Check out the links in the show notes for previous Vikramaditya stories that we have covered before. Next time, we'll continue the Mahabharata as we had originally planned. We'll continue with the Lakshagriha and we'll see how the Pandavas managed to get out of a barbecue, where they are the ones on the grill. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. I can't directly reply to those questions there, but I'll address some of them here on the show. Ligma and Rez, thank you for the feedback. Rez, it's a technicality, but Kakbhushundi can step outside the flow of time itself. He cannot travel backwards in time like I can. But Kakbhushundi can step outside our universe and observe other universes. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com, or tweet at sfipodcast, or reply to the questions on Spotify's Q&A. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.